We continue with the second chapter of the book of Esther, Achar Hadvarim Ha'ele. After some time later, Vashti has been banished. The king is all alone. Kishoch Chamat Hamelech Achashverosh Zacharet Vashti, Viet Asher Asata, Viet Asher Nigzar Aleha. When Vashti was banished, we were told there's going to be somebody else who's going to replace her, but apparently that didn't happen straight away. And the king later on, he remembered Vashti, and he thought of her, and he remembered that not all things were so bad, and so he wanted to have somebody else as a queen, as a wife. So the servants, young attendants, said to him, Yivakshu lamelech ne'arot betulot tovat mar'eh. They said, let all the beautiful young virgins, young unmarried women be sought out for your majesty. Let's have a Miss Universe contest with all of the women who will come. And one of them, right? One of them will replace Vashti for you. Apparently he likes the idea. He doesn't usually suggest ideas, the king. He usually just listens to people's ideas. And thus in verse 3, Vayafked HaMelech Pikidim B'chol Medinot Malchuto, Vayikbetsu et Kol Na'ara V'tula Tovat Mareh El Shushan Habira El Beit HaNashim El Yad Hegei Sris HaMelech Shomer HaNashim V'naton Tamrukehen. So the king, he appoints officers in all the provinces, and they gather all of the young virgins in Shushan, and they come into the harem under Haggai, who is one of the king's eunuchs. Not a surprise that the person who would be in charge of the house of the prospective young ladies would be a eunuch. And he is the one who's in charge of their cosmetics and their beauty regimen. And the woman who pleases the king will become queen in place of Vashti. The idea is accepted by Achashverosh, by the king, as a good idea. Now, of course, if we were reading the Megillah together, you would all say this, but so you can say it if you want with me, but if not, Ishu Diaya B'Shushan Abira Shmo Mordechai Ben Yair Ben Shimi Ben Kish Ishimini. Oh, by the way, in this story about Achashverosh and his palace and the many women and the drinking and the wine and the parties, there is a Jewish guy in Shushan whose name is Mordechai, the son of Yair, the son of Shimi, the son of Kish Ishimini. So we know a few things from that. A, he's from the tribe of Binyamin. He's from the family of Kish, which is the same family of the first king of Israel, Shaul. Okay? And one other thing we know about him is his name is Mordechai. Now, Mordechai, unlike Yair, Shimi, and Kish, and this would not be applicable in the year 2025, it doesn't sound like a very Jewish name if you were living in Persia at that time. Because the name Mordechai sounds a lot like the Persian god name Marduk. Marduk. It's kind of like saying today that the Messiah for the Jewish people's name is Muhammad, or Jesus, or Paul, or something of that sort. Mordechai sounds like Marduk. So it's almost like it has to identify him as being a Yehudi, because his name certainly doesn't identify him as being a Yehudi. He's Mordechai, it's like Marduk. And he's living in Shushan. Presumably, we're told in the next verse, how did he end up in Shushan? Asher hagla Yerushalayim magola asher haglata im Yechonia melech Yuda asher hagla Nebuchadnezzar melech Bavel. So why is he in Bavel? Because a long time ago, his ancestors were exiled from Jerusalem, along with Yechonia, the king of Yehuda, who was driven into exile. There's a question here as to who was the one who was exiled. Is it Mordechai when it says he had been exiled, or was it his great-grandfather who had been exiled? Most people, the general understanding has always been, it was Mordechai who was exiled. And Mordechai, and then Esther gets married to the king, and Esther's son is the one who allows the Jews to rebuild the Beit HaMikdash. But at least in the translation I have here, which I like more, it says Kish, Mordechai's great-grandfather, was the one who was exiled with Yechonia by Nebuchadnezzar, which means this would be a good 100 years or so later, maybe even more than that. If Mordechai is grown up, already has a niece who is grown up, which would possibly place this book as more modern. Biblical scholars, commentaries try to explain that this book actually takes place during the time of the second Beit HaMikdash, which makes that whole idea we talked about yesterday, this description of the book as being Jerusalem is no longer. Jerusalem is not mentioned. What's mentioned, what we're talking about is Shushan. Shushan with the inner sanctum, the Kodesh Kodashim. Shushan, the place you can't go if you are, right? The place you can't go if you are, if you're wearing clothing of mourning. That Mordechai can't go into the palace. Shushan, which is the Bira, like Yerushalayim. Shushan, which unlike the Beit HaMikdash, there's a lot of drinking going on. Beit HaMikdash, we're told, don't be drunk. So the distinctions there as to how it is revered. But it says a lot more if we say that this is these generations later, and these are the Jews who decided not to return when the second temple was rebuilt. First who returned in 539 or so, and then those who finally rebuilt in the year 516 or so before the Common Era. Continuing in verse 7, Pasuk Zayin, Vihi oman et omein et hadasai Esther batodoki in la avaim v'anara yifat toar v'tovat marev mutavia v'ima lekacham Mordechai lo levad. And Mordechai is a good guy. What does he do? He adopts Hadassah. We know her as Esther, right? It's his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother. They died. And she was a very beautiful woman. And when her father and mother died, Mordechai adopted her as his own daughter. Mordechai adopts her. The rabbis try to say bat means bayit, that he actually married her, which raises all sorts of halachic questions as to how she's married to Mordechai and becomes then the wife of Achashverosh. But here we see Mordechai shows off a beautiful thing, that he adopts a child who doesn't have parents, even if it's a family member of his, still a beautiful thing to do. Going on to their names, Esther sounds a lot like that Dustin Hoffman. Was it Dustin Hoffman in that movie, that flop Ishtar? Ishtar, before it was a flop in the Hollywoods in the late 1980s or whatever year it was. I never saw it as far as I can remember. But Ishtar is a female Persian god. So Mordechai and Esther have names like Jesus and Mary. Not quite the names you would expect from biblical heroes, from biblical, in a sense, messiahs, those who saved the Jewish people from destruction. I hope I'm not giving away the book. I'm sure you've heard it in the past. One other thing to say about this, one of the things that we may have heard about is the many things in the Megillah where Mordechai is compared to Yosef. And you think about the arc of their lives and eventually becoming second in command and putting on the beautiful clothing and saving their family, saving the Jewish people, saving the world in Yosef. But Yosef is called Yifat Toar v'Tovat Mareh. He's known as very beautiful. That's why the wife of Potiphar has the hots for him and every day tries to sleep with him. Here it is not Mordechai, it is Esther. So Esther is going to end up in the palace because of her beauty, and in a sort of a much more indirect up and down, lots of vicissitudes. Yosef, in his story, ends up in the palace. Mordechai and Esther together are able to do, in a sense, what Yosef does. Let's continue in verse 8. In Pasuk Chet. Vayhi bihi shama dvar hamelech v'dato v'kebeitz narot rabot el Shushan habira al yad Hegai v'tilakach Esther al beit hamelech el yad Hegai shomer anashim. So when the king's orders and they were gathering up the girls, Esther too was taken into the king's palace under the supervision of Hegai. Vatitavan ara beina v'tisaches levanaha vayivahel tamrukev v'narotel tetla v'shivat hanarot haruyot latetla mi beit hamelech v'yishanev v'narotel tov beit hanashim. She was a wonderful young lady, and therefore people liked her. Hegai liked her, and he gave her extra cosmetics and extra makeup and more maids to do her hair or to whatever it was that she needed. There was special kindness shown to her in the harem of Achashverosh. Sounds again a little bit like Yosef. Yosef sold into slavery, but the queen Yosef always rises to the top, becomes the head of the house of Potiphar. Lo higida Esther et amavit molarta ki Mordechai tziva ala asher lo tagid. We already told her real name is Hadassah. Hadassah, myrtle. But what is she called? She's called Esther. So, Hester, secret, hidden. Esther, right? Her identity is hidden. Mordechai tells her to hide. Ama v'et moladita. Hide who she is. Don't let anybody know. Uvechol yom v'yom Mordechai mitalech lefei chatzar beit hanashim ladat shlom Esther ma yeyaseh vad. Every day Mordechai is checking on his niece. He's checking to see what will happen to her. Uvagia, we're in verse 12. Na'ara levo ala melech Achashverosh mikot sayed lo kadat hanashim shem asar chodesh kenim lumeit rukehed shisha chodeshim b'shem amor v'shisha chodeshim samim t'krei v'tam rukei hanashim. The beauty regiment was something that was 12 months long, 6 months of oils and 6 months of perfumes. Don't ask me. I don't go to Sephora or whatever it's called. The 12-year-old girl, daughter. That's why I know about these things. And it was after the girl would go to the king, whatever she asked for would be given to her to take with her for the harem to the king's palace. Whatever it was, that was her talent. That was her way of trying to lure the king into loving her above everybody else. And we're told in verse 14, she would go in the evening and leave in the morning for a second harem. So if she's not chosen the second morning, she goes to a different eunuch, Shashgaz, and he was the guardian of the concubines. They are quasi-married to Achashverosh. Presumably they were intimate, so they weren't available for other men, but he would only, I remember 6 months ago I had this woman and I actually liked her a lot. So then he would invite her back into the palace. He would summon her by name, if he could remember those names. There's a little bit of a joke in that. A woman who he spent a few hours with 7 months earlier, 9 months earlier, a year earlier. He's going to remember all their names. Uvagia, we're in verse 15. Torah Esther bat Avichail don Mordechai shelakach lo levat lavo Elimelech. Lo biksha davar kim eit asher yomar hegai suis hamelech shomer Hashem v'ti Esther noseit chen beinei kol ra'eha. Here we see when Esther was the Esther, and how is she described? Right, we want you to know she is the daughter of Avichail. Right, something about Avichail, my father's strength. And she is the niece of Mordechai. So it's showing that, yes, she's Esther. She's hiding her Jewishness, but we're being told who she is. Okay? She's brought to the king. She doesn't ask for anything. There's nothing that she needs, that she asks to further lure the king towards her. And part of it is that just everybody seems to be drawn to her, charmed by her. When does this happen? It happens in the month of Tevet, in the 7th year of his reign. And then what happens is, we know Vashti, who refused to come out wearing the Keter Malchut, wearing the crown. The crown is placed on Esther's head. She is the one who the king wants to be his full-fledged wife, not just a concubine. What a wonderful thing. What should we do? Party. The king makes a beautiful party. The people are happier because the taxes are lowered. Because of they distributed gifts as befits the king, so they could lower the taxes. Just so you should know, just because he picked a queen doesn't mean he's done taking all the beautiful young women to the palace. There's a second time around, which may explain later in the book when Esther says, Mordechai says, go and speak to the king. You're the only one who has access to him. You're in the palace. And she says, the king hasn't called me for 30 days. Well, why hasn't he called her for 30 days? Well, there's Miss Universe pageant number 2 will go on later. Now we're told about Esther, again in verse 20, in case we didn't get it the first time. Ein Esther magen moladav yatama kasher tziva lemorchai v'et mamar Mordechai Esther osa kasher hayta v'omna ito. Esther remains a very dutiful daughter to Mordechai. She continues to listen. And even though now she's the queen, it's one thing when you're just one of 500 virgins. Now, even though now she's the queen, she continues to hide her identity. Maybe she didn't want to, but that is what Mordechai instructed her to do. Now we take a switch to something that seems irrelevant, but it's an introduction to what's going to go on into the next chapter. So that time, Mordechai was sitting in the palace gate. 2 of the king's officers and eunuchs, Bigtan and Teresh, they who are guards, they get angry for whatever reason and they plot to kill Achashverosh. Mordechai somehow finds out about the plot. Mordechai learns of it and he tells Queen Esther, and Esther reports of it. And they actually don't just say, okay, let's kill these guys. What's the big deal? Who cares? Two less guys. They look into it. I don't know what that means exactly. And the two of them get hanged on the tree. Unlike, we don't know if Vashti is hanged on the tree. She disobeys the king. Here we have people who want to kill the king. Maybe they were feminists who were unhappy with Miss Universe or Miss Persia #2. And what happens? We don't see anything done to reward Mordechai, but it gets written down. It gets written down, and in the future, it's something that we can mention. Let me just mention one thing about this little story here. When in the next chapter, we of course are going to hear about the command to bow down to Haman. Why is there a command to bow down to Haman, who is the king's new #1 officer? So presumably, it's only has to be done in the Sha'ar HaMelech. It's not something that you have to do if you're in Israel, if you're in Syria, if you're in, I don't know, India. It's only something that you have to do within the gate of the king, not even in the entire capital city. And it's a decree that comes from the king, and presumably it's some sort of loyalty test. How do you show that you're loyal to the king? Well, you bow down to the king's prime minister. When that's the way it's when the people tell Haman that Mordechai is not bowing down to him, what they say is he's not listening. It's described as he's not listening to the decree of the king. They see it as an affront to the king more than an affront to Haman. Haman may understand it as an affront to himself, but they don't see it that way. They see it as Mordechai not being loyal to the king. But if we think of this story, comes right before that episode with Haman. What's the story in a sense telling us? Mordechai doesn't have to prove his loyalty. Why should Mordechai have to prove his loyalty? Mordechai saved the king's life. Mordechai's the guy who figured out that there was a plot to kill the king. Why do I have to bow down to Haman to show my loyalty to the king if I'm Bishar HaMelech in the gate of the king? I don't have to show him my loyalty. I'm the most loyal guy. Go open the books. Find out. If I wanted the king to be killed, if I was not loyal, I wouldn't have said anything about the plot. And so it's a little bit like, what is this doing here? And it's going to come in, of course, later when Mordechai is on the horse is the thing that the king is reading. But it starts to establish this idea of sort of a loyalty test. And if we think in Jewish life of a loyalty test, right, that's part of the hook of Haman. The Jews are not loyal. They don't listen to. And look, this is an example of it. The prime example of it is Mordechai doesn't bow down to me. They're not loyal. When we know that that is not the case. The loyalty of the Jews is demonstrated by Mordechai. And we'll discuss more about this. And Mordechai is not bowing down, which is obviously one of the most important questions of the book. Why doesn't he bow down? Mordechai is the hero, but you could say Mordechai also endangers the Jews by not bowing down to Haman. We'll try to discuss it a little bit more, in addition to reading many a verse. Come tomorrow. Have a great day.